I think the best way to view this is the purpose of this whole operation was to do two things. First of all, to give a new purpose to NATO, because NATO led the airstrikes. That was the largest, by far the largest combat, the only significant combat involvement NATO had ever had since 1949, was Operation Deliberate Force. And it was a victory. Can't argue with a victory. And so it gave a new purpose to NATO after this. NATO had a new function. It had a new prestige. Secondly, it underscored the fact that the European states are impotent. They tried for years to settle the conflict, but they couldn't do it. It shows how incompetent they are. Only the United States could do it because the United States is a far-seeing, wise country.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. David Gibbs, a professor of history at the University of Arizona. The occasion is a sad one as we are commemorating this month the 30th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre in 1995, in which more than 8,000 Bosniaks lost their lives to the mass atrocities happening there. Well, what this is all about is what we want to talk about today. So David, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again, Pascal.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time for this because it is a sad anniversary. And maybe we can start with what exactly happened in Srebrenica this month 30 years ago.
Yes. What happened was that Srebrenica in 1995 was a so-called safe area. It was an area inhabited primarily by the Muslim ethnic group. And Yugoslavia, Muslim has not only religious, but a ethnic association. And during the civil war, a very complicated civil war in Bosnia, it was overrun in July of 1995. And the Serb forces then proceeded to separate the children under 16 and the women and move them out of town, and then massacred the males over the age of 16. Killing over 8,000 males. And so this has been seen as an almost iconic event. It's remembered very much as a iconic event, one that gave a certain moral or perceived moral force to interventionism. The idea was that the American-led, NATO-led intervention that occurred after this massacre was a very positive development, one that, according to the standard account, should have occurred sooner. And it also established sort of a moral standard that intervention is the proper solution to ethnic cleansing, abuse of women, all sorts of atrocities. That American-led intervention is the way you deal with these things. So it gave a good name to interventionism. And it made it seem like a moral thing to do. And it was used again and again during the lead up to the Iraq War, for example, in 2003. It was cited, look what happened at Srebrenica. We waited too long at Srebrenica. And with Libya, again, it was overthrow Gaddafi. We had to overthrow him to prevent a Srebrenica-like massacre. So this keeps coming up repeatedly. And so this really became almost a kind of a defining event.
Yeah, it comes up even now, time and again, to not just as a we did this too late, but as we have a moral obligation to prevent a second Srebrenica, right? It's necessary to intervene, otherwise we'll have another Srebrenica. But are you?
Can I just interject that I suppose one of the themes I want to make here is that all of this could have been prevented through diplomacy, and the idea was basically that the United States blocked diplomatic options that would have ended the war early or even prevented the war from beginning in the first place, and then used military intervention basically to settle it on the battlefield in a way that sort of advanced American strategic objectives at a very high cost. The whole war could have been prevented. 100,000 people's lives could have been saved. The massacre at Srebrenica probably would never have occurred. People leave that detail out. That diplomacy was a real option here, and this blocked diplomacy.
Yeah, so the disingenuity of the whole situation is that it wasn't necessary to even get to all of that place where you then only have intervention as an option to stop violence. But can we maybe roll that out a little bit? at which points, because the Srebrenica massacre happened in 1995, Bosnia-Herzegovina, right? And that was 5 years after the Soviet Union, after Yugoslavia had already started crumbling apart, right?
4 years.
Yeah, sorry, 1991 to 1995. So 4 years into the Yugoslav wars, which were a series of different political events, ending up with us now having 7 successor states out of one Yugoslavia before. So can you maybe tell us where should we start the history of the Srebrenica massacre?
I think it really did start with the breakup of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a multi-ethnic, mostly very successful communist state. It was often cited as a relatively humane form of communism that had, up until it began to fall apart in the late 70s, but in the context of, I would say, a global crisis of capitalism, which also affected non-capitalist states in Eastern Europe. But up until the 70s, and during the first maybe 25 years of its existence, Yugoslavia was considered to be an exceptionally successful communist state. Um, and, it was cited as, if not fully democratic in that sense, it was worker self-managed. There was a worker self-management system and very high rates of economic growth. Um, but it began to fall apart due to economic reasons. I know that Susan Woodward was on your podcast a few months ago, and she's been very effective in noting the importance of economics in bringing about the dissolution of Yugoslavia and bring about also a particularly ugly set of ethnic wars. Generally speaking, when people are impoverished and are required to undergo austerity and unemployment, it brings out very ugly tendencies. And that happened in Yugoslavia, clearly. So Yugoslavia began to break up, and the multi-ethnic character of Yugoslavia, which had been managed very successfully up till then, began to lead to enormous tensions. It didn't have to result in breakup, however. The key event that caused the breakup, I would say, was foreign intervention, not initially by the United States, but by Germany. In 1990, Germany had reunified, and the Germans did really have a certain, I don't know how to put it, arrogance, shall we say, sense that they now were the largest and most powerful country in Europe, and they're going to set aside their previous foreign policy timidity. And they acted outside the European Union and outside of NATO and began openly encouraging the breakup of Yugoslavia and began communicating with Slovenia and Croatia, with elites in Slovenia and Croatia, which were the richest republics. They wanted to separate for a number of reasons, including misbehavior by many actors, including Milosevic, famously. Franjo Tudjman of Croatia was another very disturbing figure. But I think the main reason they wanted to separate is they were the richest republics, and they did not want to share their wealth, basically, with the less wealthy republics. And that is really the main reason I think they wanted to separate. This comes through again and again. There was an article by two top figures in the Slovenian government who said that one of the reasons they want to separate was they'd be more effectively able to establish a free market neoliberal style economy, and they wouldn't have to share their wealth with the rest of the country. And so there really was a certain greed to it. But Germany played a critical role in basically telling them as early as 1990 that if you separate from Yugoslavia, we, the Germans, will back you. All right. And the evidence for this is overwhelming. We have it from multiple sources. We have it from Stipan Mesic, who is the former president of Croatia. We have it from David Halberstam, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author who interviewed many of the key figures. We have it from a number of different military journals. So the multiple sources point in the same direction that Germany played a critical role in letting Slovenia and Croatia know that they would be supported by Germany if they separated. I think Germany's motive here was I think partly anti-communist. German officials openly said they preferred Slovenia and Croatia because they elected non-communist parties, as opposed to Serbia, which elected the former communists. And so anti-communism was more also that Southeastern Europe had been a traditional sphere of influence of Germany. And the German private sector and the German government were both eager to reestablish German primacy in that region. And so they encouraged the breakup of Yugoslavia. They didn't really have to do much more than that. Germany was emerging as the most powerful country in Europe, and of course, it carries a lot of weight when Germany gives a green light to secession.
So for the timeline, was that in early 91? Because if I remember correctly, the Yugoslav big Communist Party meeting that was pivotal, I think happened around April or May 91, wasn't it?
I don't remember the exact day of the meeting, the time of the meeting. The actual secession was June. The secession was June of 91, formal declaration of secession. I might
By
add, but
Slovenia.
yeah, the United States during this period was preoccupied. 1991 was a very busy year for the United States. There was the first Gulf War, the largest use of military force since Vietnam. It was also the year of the breakup of the Soviet Union, so the U.S. just wasn't that interested in Yugoslavia. However, the Slovenian officials met with Lawrence Eagleburger, who was briefly Secretary of State, and basically said, the Germans are encouraging us to secede. What do you think about that? And Eagleburger said, we prefer you don't secede, but we won't do anything to stop you if you do. And so that was another, if not a green light, a yellow light for the United States. And so they basically got encouragement from abroad. And I think that was the decisive factor that led to the breakup of Yugoslavia. One more point, I know you wanted to interject something, but one more point I want to note is that Yugoslavia was, the federal system was breaking down, but a major factor that helped to sort of hold it together, at least up to that point, was the Yugoslav National Army, which was one of the largest armies in Europe. And its top officer corps, contrary to popular belief, was multi-ethnic. The top generals were of different nationalities. There's a myth that it was Serb-dominated. That is not true, certainly not among the top generals. The two top figures were General Veliko Kadijevic, who was mixed Croat and Serb, and the deputy defense minister was Admiral Stana Brovet, who was Slovenian. So this was very much a multi-ethnic, very communist-oriented, very ideological and pro-Yugoslav element. And they were fully determined to use force to stop secession. What's remarkable is the European Union and the United States both insisted use of force is inadmissible. You can't use violence to stop secession. If they want to secede, they have the right to secede. That's a remarkable development because international law up to that time had been firmly against secession, that secession is inadmissible. I come from a country, the United States, where it was established in 1861. Abraham Lincoln went to war against the South, not initially to stop slavery, but to stop secession. And so secession has always had a very sort of odious tone throughout the Cold War. But suddenly the international community was willing to accept secession. And so I think this was the main factor that led to the break of Yugoslavia, international encouragement of it.
Yeah, but we also must add that the West didn't call it secession. The Western Europe called it the right to self-determination, right? They still call it that to this day in Kosovo, the right to self-determination, not secession, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why Spain never recognized Kosovo, because they know that they have minorities, a rich minority in around Barcelona, that would like to secede. And the Basques too, who would like to do the same. But the Spanish constitution says you can only do it if all of Spain says okay. And I don't know if Yugoslavia had any formal process.
They did. The process basically said there had to be unanimity among the 8 different autonomous provinces and republics to make any change to international borders of Yugoslavia. That's what the constitution said. So it required unanimity of the different elements of the Yugoslav state to separate. And of course, there wasn't unanimity. It was illegal under the Constitution.
So the
legality, yes.
Yeah, so the Germans and the U.S. saying, like, if you want to secede, then we support that, will be like today them saying like, okay, if the different parts of Spain want to secede, then we'll give you a green light and you can like dissolve the Spanish state. And of course the Yugoslavs again, the party members, the point is that the leaders also of this secession were, correct me if I'm wrong, but they were all communists, weren't they? Like the Franjo Tuđman.
Not quite. Izetbegovic of Bosnia-Herzegovina was the only major figure who was non-communist, but everyone else, yeah. Kučan of Slovenia, Tuđman of Croatia, of course, Milosevic of Serbia, they're all former communists who left the party as the party was sort of disintegrating. The party really was no longer really functioning at a federal level by 1991. The only really Yugoslav element that was still intact was the army.
Why is Why is it that the United States gave, like, you said, a yellow light? Because, like, in the same year, 1991, in August, um, uh, George H.W. Bush gave an important speech in Ukraine, right, to the Ukrainian Rada, saying, like, we please do not secede. We think it's better if the Soviet Union stays together. Why, in the context of Yugoslavia, it looks as if though there was more support for secession?
I'm not sure. It may have been a fit of absent-mindedness. It does seem like the United States was not focused on Yugoslavia, and mostly they just basically allowed Germany to take the lead. Um, a later Secretary of State after Eagleburger, his name was Baker, James Baker, had said that we don't have a dog in this fight. That was his phrase. So they allowed the Europeans to dominate what was initially seen as a parochial uh, political instability, one not of concern to the United States, which had grander ambitions, or what seemed like grander ambitions at the time. Only later did the United States come in. I'll get to that in a moment, but initially it was German-led. Um, and this was Germany really did play a critical role here, and this is really the only case I could think of where Germany acted unilaterally. It acted outside the EU. It acted without permission from the Americans, even though the U.S. later endorsed what they did. And so this was really initially a German foray into great power politics, celebrating, I guess, their newfound power resulting from reunification. And so this, by the way, this set a very bad precedent because you might say one of the great achievements of the Cold War was no secession. You had decolonization, but that was legally a completely different thing. But breaking up countries was seen as verboten. This was not allowed. It was too destabilizing. I have a background, by the way, as an Africanist. That's where I began. And one of the things in Africa was you never break up countries because if you start changing the borders, there'll be no end to the bloodshed and the instability. So it's better to keep the borders intact, even if they're very flawed. And that became a worldwide norm. And this was ended with Yugoslavia. And this really introduces a whole new element of instability to the world politics ever since. I don't think this has been fully appreciated that Yugoslavia did sort of open a Pandora's box, you might say, worldwide, not just for Yugoslavia, but the whole globe.
It also, it's one of the things that makes people like us a little bit irky when we hear Europeans say that in 2022 is the first time since the Second World War that borders are changed by force through Russia. It's like, no, borders change by force. I mean, we cannot forget the 10 years of Yugoslavia. I mean, please. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think basically the U.S. position is no country has the right to change their borders unless we orchestrate it, unless the U.S. orchestrates it. I think that's the U.S. position.
so
Um,
as this moved forward in 91, like what changed? Because at some point America became pivotal actually in preventing a deal that the Europeans, as you explained last time, tried to broker in order to prevent the bloodshed. Can you explain that one?
yes, the context here. The context again was that with the end of the Cold War, Europe began getting. I mentioned this in my previous discussion with you, that Europe began getting ambitions of acting independently from NATO. It was assumed NATO would wither away. I don't think anybody called for actually abolishing NATO, but it was assumed NATO would wither away without any purpose. And the United States would be in a position to establish unparalleled dominance, and that the Europeans felt was unhealthy, and that Europe could act as a check on American unilateralism. Now that the Soviet Union was gone, NATO was no longer needed, since after all, there was no Soviet Union, there was no threat there. And so, and the United States was determined to block this. The United States was determined to reaffirm the value of NATO and to block European independence. I was looking for an opportunity to do so. And I think what caused them to change their mind about Yugoslavia was simply this. By early 1992, it was evident Yugoslavia was becoming a major world issue. The press was covering it all the time. It was getting major attention. It was it seemed like an issue that it was an embarrassment the United States was not deeply involved in this issue. And it looked like the Europeans were going to use the Yugoslav war as an opportunity to demonstrate their capacity to act as a world power. Bear in mind that in 1991, there was the Maastricht Conference, where basically Europe decided to establish essentially its own foreign policy, to establish a foreign policy presence in the world. And again, the United States was determined to insist that if they did this, it would be done under the wing of the United States and what would block Europe's effort at independence. And Yugoslavia became the arena in which they would achieve that. And so what the United States now had to do was that since Germany essentially had sponsored the secession of Slovenia and Croatia, the United States would sponsor the secession of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Yugoslavia hadn't fully broken up yet, but in early 1992, with the impending breakup of the whole country, Bosnia-Herzegovina was getting ready to secede, and the United States strongly encouraged this, and it began establishing close ties to the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina under Ali Izetbegovic. A bit about Bosnia-Herzegovina: it's a very complicated republic in that it has three ethnic groups. The largest were the Bosnian Muslims. I think they were 44% of the population. Then ethnic Serbs, who were about a third, and then Croats, who were the rest. And so these three ethnic groups, there was always some degree of tension between them. And now there was a fear of ethnic war, which of course happened. And so the European Union brought together the three ethnic groups in Lisbon in early 1992 and established an agreement for decentralization of power within a Bosnian state, where each ethnic group would be dominant in a certain part of, politically dominant, according to the constitution, in certain parts of Bosnia. And most of the land was given to the Bosnian Muslims, who were given 43, the Serbs, I think, were given the largest amount of land, 43%, because they'd been traditionally rural. They controlled most of the land. And it was divided among the different ethnic groups, and this was to be a very decentralized system. And Ali Izetbegovic and the Croats, everybody was ready to sign. They were on the verge of signing. It was being brokered by the Portuguese diplomat José Coutinho and by Peter Carrington, the former British foreign minister. And then the U.S. ambassador, Warren Zimmerman, met with both the Croats and the Muslims and said, "You don't have to sign if you don't want to," with a strong implication the United States would back them if they didn't sign. And the U.S. basically encouraged them not to sign. And then the agreement broke down completely. Both the Bosnian Muslims and the Croats withdrew from the agreement, and that was it. That was the end of the agreement. And then the country went to war shortly after that. And this is a great tragedy because the war could have been prevented by this agreement. The myth is that the Serbs would never agree to this because they're so aggressive. The Serbs were enthusiastic about this agreement. Radovan Karadzic became one of the most aggressive figures, committed many atrocities. Is Bosnian Serb leader. He celebrated this agreement as a wonderful thing. The CIA published a report later in which they said even after the breakdown of the agreement, the Serbs were eager to revive the agreement for a period of time. And so this was a very viable agreement. It very likely would have prevented the war. And that's exactly what the U.S. did not want, because that would have given credibility to the European Union to act independently of the United States. The U.S. position was that nobody should solve this problem except the United States. And if it's necessary to have a war to prove that, so be it. That was, in essence, the American position.
This is so sad. It's also, for us who've been watching also how the war in Ukraine and the Russo-Ukrainian war unfolded over time, it's just so reminiscent of all of these moments when diplomacy was at the verge of preventing the bloodshed, and how diplomacy, if it is torpedoed, even just by one major power, not by sinking the agreement, but by encouraging one of the parties to not take it, how then war becomes the inevitable outcome of that, which is actually the preferred method, right? We've had it in 2022 in April in Istanbul when the US and UK told Ukraine, don't sign, don't take it.
That's right.
We'll solve it on the battlefield. And we had it in 1992 when they said, like 30 years earlier, don't sign, we'll solve it on the battlefield. And of course, the battlefield then became extremely brutal, and it led to all the way to Srebrenica.
That's right. It would have been no Srebrenica. You wouldn't have had to basically be talking about Srebrenica if they'd signed that agreement. And yes, the parallel here is very close, of course, to the lead up to the Ukraine war, including the Istanbul Accords, which were blocked by the United States and Britain. In those days, by the way, Britain was acting much more independently of the United States. It was acting in support of a peaceful settlement in accord with the European Union. And later on, they became, I don't know, America's favorite puppy dog, maybe. But the oh, one more point I do want to add here is this was a period when the neoconservative element in the U.S. foreign policy establishment was gaining increasing power, particularly Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And he came up with a plan, basically, for unilateral U.S. dominance as the guiding force that should be guiding America's policy in the post-Cold War period. And I think Bosnia-Herzegovina was to be the main test case for Wolfowitz's plan. And one of the main features of the neoconservatives is not to negotiate. You don't negotiate, you use force to achieve your objective. Because negotiating involves compromise. The US doesn't like compromise. And so anyway, so this is the first instance basically of US blocking negotiations. There are others as well. But let me see if you have a question before I go any further.
No, I want to actually ask you then what other stages of the conflict are important to build up toward the massacre in Srebrenica? If there was there another moment when things could have been de-escalated?
Yes. Well, first of all, the war did begin shortly after the breakdown of the Lisbon Agreement and took the form initially of initially there was briefly an alliance between the Croats and the Muslims, but it was sort of a marriage of convenience against the Serbs. The bottom line is when the Yugoslav National Army began to break up and Milosevic assumed dominance basically or remained of it, he purged the non-Serb elements within it and made it an instrument of Serb hegemony. And in the process of the breakup, a lot of its officers and heavy equipment were given to ethnic Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina and also ethnic Serbs in Croatia as well. And as on account of that, the Serbs had the most guns, to put it very simply. And in the ethnic war that commenced in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Serbs always, until the end, the Serbs had the upper hand because they had the most weaponry. And they were in a position to engage in aggressive behavior and ethnically cleanse most of the country. And within a few months, they controlled, I believe, 70% of the surface of Bosnia-Herzegovina, engaged in mass ethnic cleansing against both the Bosnian Muslims and the Croats. I really have to say that none of the sides here acted with very much moral valor. Certainly the Serbs didn't, but the Muslims and the Croats basically, first of all, they themselves had a war that lasted almost a year. Their alliance broke up and it became a three-way war with vicious atrocities committed. They never had as many guns as the Serbs. They didn't commit as much aggression as the Serbs or as many atrocities. The best estimate we have is there was a study done by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which estimated deaths basically during the war involved twice as many deaths among the Croats and Muslims as the Serbs. So that reflected the fact that the Serbs were the more aggressive party because they had the most weapons. But when the good guys, so to speak, they were presented as the good guys, the Bosnian Muslims and Croats, when they had the opportunity, they committed terrible atrocities as well. Not on the same scale, though, because they had fewer guns. Just as one instance of this, the NATO officials, including General Boyd, a top NATO general, said in Foreign Affairs that there's no doubt that the Bosnian Muslims would often shell their own civilians and blame it on the Serbs. This is done regularly. And so there was very cynical behavior by the Bosnian Muslims. One should not underestimate their brutality as well, their potential for brutality. But again, it wasn't the same scale as the Serbs. I keep coming back to that because the Serbs simply had more weapons. That's my read of it. Most people would say it's because the Serbs were just worse people and more aggressive people. But I don't think a close reading of the evidence suggests that's true. I think it was just the Serbs were more capable of aggressive behavior and atrocities. In any case, I'm sorry. Do you want to add something there?
No, it's also like one thing that we must not underestimate is also just the sheer the sheer complexity then of the military situation, because it was not under central control all the time, right? The Serbs, and especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Serb forces were under control of different factions, and you had very strong these violent tendencies among these paramilitary groups to also get revenge for whatever other atrocities they had to suffer, right? So you get the entire logic of this violence that then begets more violence, and you have these separatist forces, these separate forces that start fighting. So it was not like all coordinated by like the central command. I think the Serbian forces were actually the most integrated in that sense, but the others certainly weren't.
Yeah, I think that's probably true because the middle ranking officers of the Yugoslav National Army were disproportionately Serbs, and a lot of those officers went over to the Bosnian Serb army, and so they had better integration. It was a very complicated, it is extremely complicated war, no doubt about it. By the way, I should add, the Bosnian Serbs did receive significant assistance from the Republic of Serbia, led by Milosevic, and so so that's the way the war proceeded. Now, throughout this period, two things were happening. First of all, the Europeans continued doggedly to try and achieve a negotiated settlement, acting with the UN Secretariat throughout the war, really, throughout most of the war, led by David Owen, the former British foreign minister, had now replaced the Portuguese diplomat. And David Owen wrote his memoirs, and for literally years, he was trying to broker an agreement somewhat similar to that of the Lisbon Agreement. And he said the main impediment to this, the United States just kept torpedoing his efforts. Again, this is a very cynical thing to do, that the United States would torpedo the efforts. Now, I should add there was a moral basis for this, supposedly, and the moral basis was that the United States kept claiming that the Serbs were being given too much control over too much land under the Owen proposals. They were going to be given 43% of the land, whereas they were only, I think, 31% of the population. And that was a sellout. It was a giveaway to the Serbs. It was a reward for ethnic cleansing, the Americans said. That's not really true, though, because again, the Serbs are mostly rural, meaning that they were country peoples. They naturally controlled more land than the other groups on account of their rural demographics. But in any case, whatever the case, surely it would have been better to end the war early. It would have been more moral to end the war early, but the Americans kept blocking it. And I think the reason was they didn't want the Europeans to get credit for ending the war. Now, the issue was, why didn't the United States intervene directly in the war and settle it on American terms? They eventually did that, but it took them a long time. Why did it take them so long? That's an interesting question. I think the reason was that even though the political level, first under Bush and then more so under Clinton, didn't want to intervene militarily, the U.S. military was skittish about this. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff initially, under both Bush and then in the first months of the Clinton presidency, was General Colin Powell, the very famous Colin Powell, who'd won the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And it was at the height of his influence, and he was a veteran who'd served in Vietnam in the early days and had very bitter memories of the fiasco of Vietnam and how disastrous Vietnam was, not just for the country, but for the army. He spent his whole career in the army. And he did not want a repeat of Vietnam. And so he was very leery of any intervention that risked long-term American commitment without an immediate possibility of victory. And so he basically blocked any direct intervention by the United States. This wasn't true across the whole military. The Air Force was very eager to intervene. And there were certainly Army generals, Wesley Clark, for example, did want to intervene. But again, Powell basically blocked this from happening. And so you had an extended period of time, the United States very awkwardly was trying to block negotiated settlements and encouraging the Bosnian Muslims that eventually will enable you to settle this in the battlefield, but was not really giving them the wherewithal to do so. And so you had this vicious war going on, and the United States had this schizophrenic policy, blocking negotiated settlements, but not actually intervening with force.
So where did the weapons come from that the other side used? I mean, part of it must have been the stockpile, right? But that the Croats and the Bosniaks were able to use. But where did the rest come from? Were there illicit?
Well, that's the story. Basically, a shift began in American policy at the end of 1993 when Powell stepped down as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Shalikashvili, was much more open to intervention. And the United States first basically needed to settle diplomatically the war between the Croats and the Muslims and to establish a united front between the two of them which it did.
Because they were also fighting the Croats and the.
It became basically was a three-way war. And it wasn't in the United States. The narrative is very important here, as you know. And narrative was vital, and the narrative was all the aggressions being undertaken by the Serbs. The only thing you need to know about this extremely complex war is you have these very aggressive people named the Serbs, and they were presented really in very ways that were really pretty hateful, you might say. That the Serbs were just bad people. And the problem was that didn't really correspond to the reality because it was a three-way war. All three sides were going at each other's throats. And so the United States had to settle this war between the Croats and the Muslims, which it did diplomatically, and established that you need to settle the war. And it was done in Washington, the settlement. And then we'll back you on the battlefield. And then the United States began arranging for Iran, of all places, to begin giving weapons to the Bosnian Muslim Croat alliance, and also the government of Croatia simultaneously. We'll get to the Croatia's involvement in a moment. And this violated a UN arms embargo, but the United States simply violated the arms embargo. The US helped deliver the arms. Again, that was a technical violation of international law, but it was done anyway.
Was it known at the time, or was it?
No, it was not. It was in secret, and it only came out later. A Dutch investigator who had access to the NATO archives wrote a report for the International Criminal Tribunal, the former Yugoslavia. He basically exposed the arms deliveries. And so with the new arms, you gradually began getting a somewhat more even playing field. Although still the Serbs basically still had the dominant position. And what they needed was what eventually settled it was that the government of Croatia came in on the Bosnian side, and the United States NATO began airstrikes. But again, there still was resistance in the military to actually doing this. And so the United States continued to not deal the final blow to the Serbs. What they were waiting for, I think, was some sensational event that galvanized public opinion. That event was Srebrenica. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, can you give us the timeline? Because like Slovenia secedes from Yugoslavia in 91, very, very early in summer, I believe, 3 days of fighting and then over. And Croatia was much bloodier and more difficult, but it was the second one, 92, 93, when it officially kind
91, of 91, both occurred 91.
91.
And then 92 was Bosnia. And then Bosnia began what was in effect a 3.5-year war. Bosnia was by far the most bloody of all the Yugoslav wars, 100,000 deaths total on all sides.
Yeah. Although like the Croatian secession also, it came along with a lot of ethnic cleansing on both sides. There was a large.
Yes, well, I'll get to that. Yes, I'll get to that. Okay. Yeah. So basically, and the United States also began preparing Croatia for an offensive, and they sent what are called military contractors, one might cynically more call them mercenaries, licensed by the United States to train the Croatian army with their new weapons and to prepare them basically for an offensive to end the war. In Croatia itself, which itself had a war, there was a secession by the Serb-speaking regions, a place called Krajina, and to basically settle that war and then basically intervene in Bosnia-Herzegovina on the side of the Muslim Croat Federation against the Serbs. What happened first, though, was a terrible massacre in Srebrenica. That was really the thing that the United States used as a opportunity, shall we say, to settle the war on U.S. terms. What happened in Srebrenica was pulled a safe area, and that the United Nations had sent a peacekeeping force. It really was a very effectual peacekeeping force because it wasn't clear what its mission was. And so it established basically several safe areas, several safe zones of towns basically that would be occupied by UN forces that would be off limits to Serb attack. And Srebrenica was one of these towns. And it was a predominantly Serb, actually probably predominantly a Muslim town. Now, something that's very clear from the UN reports, however, is that this was not a disarmed town. The Bosnian army had units there, and a full division, I believe, there, under someone named Nasser Oric. And he was able to engage in forays against Serb positions from Srebrenica, but the Serbs were not able to fully retaliate because it was a safe area.
Mm.
Nor Oric, by the way, did have a very bad reputation for atrocities. And this did come out. Even prosecution witnesses against Milosevic acknowledged that he had a terrible reputation for atrocities. And um, at a certain point, it does seem that it's very possible that Bosnian government made a decision to let Srebrenica fall because they began removing their heavy equipment from it in July. This is confirmed by Carl Bildt, basically a former Swedish prime minister who was one of the EU mediators during this period. And he confirms basically that there does seem to have been a decision taken by the Muslim government to let Srebrenica fall, and that would so shock world opinion, it would lead to intervention, which is what happened. And so this was a very cynical act by the Bosnian government to remove their heavy equipment. This is confirmed also by Jane's Defense Weekly, that this was happening. So multiple sources confirmed that there was a remarkable removal of heavy equipment by the Bosnian army in the period just before the Serb attack. There also were UN forces there, but they were lightly armed. There was a Dutch battalion. They were blamed for the fall of the city, but it's not clear they really had enough weapons to stop it. But in any case, the Serbs did take over the town. They also took over Gorazde, and they were really seemed particularly embittered by Srebrenica. Gorazde, they didn't commit anywhere near these atrocities, but in Srebrenica, they rounded up all the men. Mm. It's been said men and boys, but I think the vast majority, 90% of the people killed were males over 16.
Yeah.
In other words, military age. And they executed them. And so this was unquestionably a huge war crime. It's been called genocide, actually, at the International Criminal Tribunal. It was defined as genocide by the court. That really is open to question. There was an article in a Yale Law Review, not the Yale Law Journal itself, but I think Yale Journal of International Law, that did raise real questions to whether or not it met the standard of genocide. William Shabas, who was an Irish jurist, Irish professor of law, I believe, who was the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, had said he did not think it met the standard for genocide. But nevertheless, it was called genocide, whether rightly or wrongly.
Yeah.
I think I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, just to put here, like, something is a war crime is already bad enough. Genocide is the crime of crimes. I'm personally in favor of lowering the bar to make something a genocide because we want to prevent all of such situations as much as possible. Unfortunately, what we are seeing is that even with the dedication of genocide, we have very clear geopolitical interests when Western actors want to label any war crime that happens that is useful to them as a genocide, including, the genocide against the Uyghurs by China, right? That's apparently one. Srebrenica and so on. But anything that happens with the side that we support, like Israel and Palestine, if you call it a genocide, then you are a persona non grata, right? Because they barely commit any crimes at all, according to the Western narrative. But okay, here we are in a place where we have a large atrocity, a massive atrocity.
No question about it. It was a huge atrocity. Again, I think what you had here with the use of the word genocide is you did have a redefinition of genocide, and then up until then, genocide had never been used unless you had hundreds of thousands of deaths. Never, not in any serious way. And this was the first time it was a lowering of the bar, a significant lowering of the bar. And the problem is, basically, if genocide applies to all war crimes, and some academics began writing that maybe we should define genocide even in terms of fatal events like ethnic cleansing or even cultural genocide. And it seems to me if you start broadening the definition of genocide to mean almost all kinds of atrocities, and it's not clear what it really means anymore, and it starts losing meaning. I am very fearful of that possibility. And I think that's a real danger. I mean, critics like Shabas have made that point, and I think it's a legitimate point, that if you overuse a term, it loses meaning. In practice, what it has meant is that up until Gaza, genocide was only used against potential enemies or actual enemies of the United States. All right. Only enemies of the United States commit genocide. The United States never commits genocide, and allies of the United States never commit genocide. That's not strictly true. I mean, I think there's been some discussion of some colonial events have been genocidal, including things like what the Belgians did in the Congo. But that was long ago. In terms of recent events, um, genocide as up until Gaza has only been applied against American enemies, against the Chinese and with the Uyghurs, um, and it's always been applied against up until the Gaza events. Of course, Russia was committing genocide in Ukraine, and we keep hearing this again and again that America's enemies commit genocide. All right, but the United States doesn't do it. And so this really had a very politicized, weaponized kind of character to it, the word genocide, which I find disturbing. Now, this did open up again, it opened up an issue here because once you start broadening the definition of genocide, um, well, the bottom line is the United States has itself become complicit in genocide in Gaza. All right, what's happened in Gaza, I would say, in my view, much more clearly fits the classical definition of genocide. All right. And a much more credible case can be made that what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, in terms of both its effect and intent, is genocidal. And the United States is, of course, very deeply complicit in this, as are many European countries deeply complicit in this. And that's a very uncomfortable fact for the United States. But that's really an aberration because up till then, the United States is heroically fighting against genocide. And the only criticism you can make of America is when it doesn't intervene.
Yeah, when it doesn't stop genocide soon enough through intervention. That's why this narrative of Srebrenica and the entire then moral necessity also to bomb Serbia in 1999 in order to prevent another Srebrenica is so important, right? And it stayed with us time and again. Can you maybe take us a little bit forward beyond like 95 into how it developed?
Let me wrap up a little bit what happened in Bosnia. That after the Srebrenica massacre, you then had several things happen. First of all, the Croatian government was given a green light by the United States to attack the ethnic Serbs in the Krajina region, which had been separated, and ethnically cleanse the ethnic Serbs from Krajina and expelled about 150,000 people by force. One of the largest acts of ethnic cleansing of the war, actually, with American support, with direct American support and encouragement. Then the Croatian army moved into Bosnia-Herzegovina, linked up with the Bosnian army, and began moving against the Serbs and rolling back Serb gains. Simultaneously, NATO entered the game, and you had Operation Deliberate Force, which is a series of coordinated airstrikes by NATO against Serb positions. About 2 weeks, I think it lasted about 2 weeks. And so what you had is basically NATO attacking from the air, and NATO's ground forces were the Bosnian army, the Muslim Croat army, and the Croatian government army. And they began pushing the Serbs back. And then after they could claim military victory, the United States brought all the parties together in an Air Force base in Dayton, Ohio. All right. And in Dayton, Ohio, they brokered a peace agreement. I should add that it was made very clear that only the United States would participate in this. The Europeans were only involved as observers. There was almost a ritualized humiliation of the European states in the Dayton process. And what emerged from this was a sensational success. It ended the war. It, remarkably, though, it was almost identical to what the Europeans had been proposing for years through Owen. It was hardly different. And in fact, it was more generous to the Serbs. It gave the Serbs 49% of the land of Bosnia, whereas the Owen plan only gave 43% of the land, and that was considered a sellout, but nobody seemed to mind because the Americans did it. And so I think the best way to view this is the purpose of this whole operation was to do two things. First of all, to give a new purpose to NATO, because NATO led the airstrikes. That was the largest, by far the largest combat, the only significant combat involvement NATO had ever had since 1949 was Operation Deliberate Force. And it was a victory. Can't argue with a victory. And so it gave a new purpose to NATO after this. NATO had a new function. It had a new prestige. Secondly, it underscored the fact that the European states are impotent. They tried for years to settle the conflict, but they couldn't do it. Shows how incompetent they are. Only the United States could do it because the United States is a far-seeing, wise country. That's how it was presented. It was very much celebrated by Richard Holbrooke, the American State Department official who orchestrated it. His memoirs were widely celebrated as a literary work of art, I guess. And he was presented as a hero. Um, and remarkably, though, he didn't really offer anything that had already been offered by the Europeans. And this war could have been settled years earlier had the Americans allowed it, but they wouldn't allow it because they did not want Europe to get the credit for it. And they didn't want something that could undermine NATO's credibility. Instead, and one more thing is that when the war was over, the Muslim Croat forces engaged in a massive spate of ethnic cleansing throughout Bosnia and ethnically cleansed, I think, during the latter phases of the war and the phase immediately after the war, I think another maybe 150, 200,000 Serbs. Again, this was not as many. The number of Serbs who were ethnically cleansed in Croatia and Bosnia were not as many as those, were nowhere near as many as those the Serbs had ethnically cleansed during 3.5 years of war, but it was substantial all the same. And it was done basically, at least with the encouragement, and certainly not any condemnation by the United States and NATO. And then to make sure this operation was successful, I think 60,000 NATO forces were deployed, the I-4 forces. And it was only supposed to last a year, but of course it lasted up to the present day. It was replaced by peacekeeping forces from the European Union. And today, basically, Bosnia is essentially a colony of the European Union. Initially NATO and now you're the European Union. All decisions are made by the Office of the High Commissioner, appointed by the European Union, who is able to basically veto government decisions by the Bosnian government. Bosnia is always in danger of breaking up, which is why basically you still have peacekeeping forces. They're just like Kosovo. It's a little bit of a revival of the League of Nations mandate system, which was basically an extended era of colonialism. It's a new form of colonialism, you might say, benign colonialism, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, just need to look up the flag of Bosnia Herzegovina. It's the European Union colors, yellow and blue with the stars, and it's like yeah.
And so that's basically this gave a new lease on life for NATO, and it undermined European solidarity and European efforts at achieving an independence from the United States. And it also gave critically, I mean, Srebrenica gave a whole new justification for intervention, which is to prevent ethnic cleansing and genocide. And that it was celebrated particularly in a book by Samantha Power, later became a top government official, called America in the Age of A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. And the theme of it was America intervenes too late or doesn't intervene enough. We should intervene more. Intervention is a good thing. It's a moral thing to do. Give a moral justification for intervention. And put it on a higher plane.
From that side of the narrative, the criticism of the government, speaking truth to power, is that we should intervene sooner in order to save more lives and go and bomb at the first possible instance. But just one more thing, because I do think that the Europeans get something out of this, even though, yes, the humiliation and so on, and the precedent setting that the United States is again a force for peace, right? Bringing peace, Dayton, Ohio, the big piece of our time for the former Yugoslavia, which of course it wasn't, and then you had Kosovo and so on, but let's not go into that one. But the thing that I do believe the Europeans are getting is the honorary role of then being I4 and keeping Bosnia together, because there is the possibility of another secession, right? And the Croats in Bosnia Herzegovina, they could easily join Croatia, right? They're bordering and so on. I mean, that would be simple, but the Europeans say like, no, you stay together because you are our success case of bringing peace.
Exactly.
So like honorary second in the imperial structure.
I think the Europeans basically decided, I think Bosnia wasn't enough. They were very embittered by Bosnia. They needed a second lesson. The second lesson, of course, was Kosovo. But I think after Kosovo and Bosnia, they did decide if you can't beat them, join them. That's the phrase I used before, and I'll say it again. It's that there's no way, after Kosovo, they realized there's no way you can really oppose the Americans. And so they did what's international relations theory called bandwagoning. They bandwagoned with the winner, the United States. And the idea is that maybe the United States will allow you certain crumbs that will enable you to achieve some degree of have some role. And also I should add, of course, the A major factor here is the vested interest associated with the Cold War. The weapons manufacturers benefited immensely from the fact that NATO had now had a new function. And this was not only in the United States, but also in Europe. Arms manufacturers in places like France and the European Union now basically would also have, new contracts, and this would be maintained. And so, you had multiple factors here behind Europe's submissiveness to the United States, but it's a submissiveness that was won through confrontation and through constant browbeating, you might say, and at a very high cost. 100,000 people lost their lives, who might very well be alive today had it not been for the continuous efforts by the United States to block European efforts to settle this matter.
Yeah,
Which means
and extremely large migrant flows as well. I mean, the number of people who left Yugoslavia and settled also in Austria, Switzerland, Germany, and so on because they were forced right out is another tragedy. Luckily, today these wounds are healing. My best friends are Bosnian Serb and Bosnian Croat who got married and are the wounds are healing. Luckily, but the atrocities were huge, and the narrative today, as you correctly pointed out, to all blame it on the Serbs is one of these kind of, oh, let's just blame everything on Hussein, let's just blame everything on one, and
a boogeyman theory of history.
Boogeyman theory of history. Just one thing, like, did the United States at that point, of that stage of the warfare, already get military bases out of it? Because today the most important US base is, of course, in Kosovo, and that one only came later. And at that point, what do you think there was already kind of a strategy of having boots on the ground for future use?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the U.S. basing presence is in Bosnia-Herzegovina today. I'm not sure. I do know a very large base, of course, is present. U.S. base is present in Kosovo, but I just really can't give you specifics on the issue in Bosnia. But I think the most important thing again is that NATO was given a new purpose, and that was a major U.S. objective, was to give NATO a new lease on life and to block European efforts to challenge NATO. And that was achieved. That was achieved big time. And Yugoslavia was what enabled it to be achieved. And so that was seen as a huge accomplishment. Again, it's on the backs of a lot of people who suffered on account of those things. It had other effects as well. You mentioned the refugee flows into Europe. As we know, in both Europe and also in the United States, the issue of immigration is a very contentious issue. The polls show that was a very significant factor in the rise of Donald Trump, as it is in Germany with the AfD and all the right-wing parties, with the Le Pen's party and so on, in France. And what's often left out of this discussion about immigration is how much U.S.-sponsored wars often cause these immigrant flows. I mean, if you destabilize countries in former Yugoslavia, if you destabilize countries in the Middle East through the war on terror, if you destabilize them through efforts to overthrow the Syrian government through Operation Timber Sycamore, all of these things produce massive flows of immigrants. In the United States, all the wars in Central America in the 1980s helped drive increased immigration to the United States. All of this is politically destabilizing.
Yeah.
So this has multiple negative effects. People like to pretend it's only a benefit, but look at all the negative effects this has had.
A couple of Europeans are starting to understand this. Most interesting, recently, the AfD actually publicly said that they are against US and Israeli intervention in Iran. They are not backing this because they one of the main reasons being like, we don't want another couple of million Muslims from Iran flowing to Europe. So some parts are understanding this, but other parts are still very much behind the narrative of we need to intervene, otherwise another Srebrenica and mass casualties. Maybe a very last thing, because one thing that's important about the 1990s is, of course, the more or less absence of the Soviet Union and Russia from world affairs, because busy with their own disintegration. The Russian reaction, just very briefly to this, they were not happy about this, were they?
No, they were not. I think that what they did see, first of all, they did have some ethnic connection to the Serbs, and they identified somewhat with the Serbs as fellow Eastern Orthodox. And they sort of what they perceived from their perspective as U.S. and NATO bullying of the Serbs, relentless bullying of the Serbs, made them wonder if they would be next. This is true in Bosnia. It was much more true in Kosovo. I think Kosovo was something of a turning point for much of Russia's elite in terms of viewing the United States and U.S. hegemony in a much more sinister light, and viewing NATO in a much more sinister light. And so, there's no doubt that this also did set the seeds basically for Russian conflict with NATO and the current war in Ukraine.
Yeah. So the poisoning of the relationship goes back all the way to right the end of the Cold War and into the Yugoslav wars, and we often forget that. David Gibbs, people want to read from you. I will send them to the links of your books.
Yeah. And my books, my 2009 book on Yugoslavia, First in Awe.
I'll put that into the link into the description. David Gibbs, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal.